sold to the scarred Earl, and her father's debt was her life sentence. There was a rule in Yorkshire that every child learned: never look at Blackwood Hall. But Marjorie Vance had no choice. She was sold. The price? Her father's gambling debts. The buyer? A man the world had chosen to forget, hidden behind a leather mask he had sworn never to remove. Yet what Marjorie found in the silent corridors of that mansion was not a monster, but a wound that needed light. Would you dare to love a man who refuses to be seen? And so, she did not go to Blackwood Hall for love. She went because her father wagered the family name at a card table and lost, because 4 younger sisters needed to eat, because when the world handed her a contract as cold as Yorkshire stone, she looked at her calloused hands and thought, "I have done the impossible before." He had a mansion that feared its own master, a dead garden, a mask he never removed, and 11 years of silence enough to unnerve anyone. But Marjorie Vance had never learned to retreat. This is the story of a pact that became a promise, of a garden that insisted on blooming, of 2 hearts that arrived by obligation and stayed by choice. The winter pact begins now. Stay until the end. Stay. This is a story that warms those who remain. Her father told her she should be grateful, that marrying the Earl of Blackwood, the man all of England had deliberately forgotten, was an honor. Marjorie Vance looked at her hands as he spoke, hands that had cooked, scrubbed and mended for 10 years so her younger sisters would not starve. Hands, she thought, with the cold calm of someone who has already reached the bottom more than once, that if this was the price of survival, she would pay it. No one warned her about the dead garden, about the servants who trembled at the sound of his footsteps, about the leather mask he never removed in anyone's presence. No one warned her that she, who believed she had nothing left to lose, could still lose her heart. There was an unspoken rule in Yorkshire that every child learned before they could walk. Do not look at Blackwood Hall, not because the mansion was dangerous, though many claimed it was, but because to look at it was a kind of mourning, a reminder that not all greatness survives time with dignity. Some things simply age, and what was once majestic becomes only large and empty. Marjorie looked. She looked the entire carriage ride, through the fogged window, as November Yorkshire swallowed the road in grey and tree branches struck the roof like fingers begging entry. She looked because it was the only thing left for her to do. Her father had taken every other option and wagered it on a card table in London. Marjorie Vance, 28 years old, the eldest of 4 sisters, skilled at cooking, mending stockings and never crying in front of anyone, and now betrothed to the Earl of Blackwood. The carriage stopped. The butler, a small man named Hobbs, with eyes that seemed always to be calculating something, opened the door without looking directly at her. It was the first of many times she would notice this at Blackwood Hall. The servants did not meet anyone's gaze. They had learned it was safer that way. The library lay in the east wing, separated from the rest of the house by a corridor so narrow the walls nearly brushed one's shoulders. It was intentional, Marjorie would later understand. Abner Hill had built labyrinths around himself, not of stone but of architecture, silence and absence. He stood with his back to her when she entered, tall, shoulders tense like a man who had carried weight so long he no longer knew he carried it. Dark hair, slightly longer than fashion allowed, and a coat that cost more than Marjorie's family spent in 6 months. The leather mask covered the left side of his face. She saw it only when he turned, slowly, as though her presence were a minor inconvenience he had chosen to tolerate. "Miss Vance," he said. It was not a question. "The same," she replied. There was a pause. He examined her as one inspects property before signing papers, methodically, unhurriedly, without particular courtesy. "You are older than I expected." "And you are ruder than I was warned," she said, "which, given what I was told, is quite an achievement." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Marjorie counted them. Then something happened, something she would later learn was extraordinarily rare at Blackwood Hall. The corner of Brendan Hill's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the intention of one. "Sit down, Miss Vance." She did. The terms were simple, as all well-managed cruelty tends to be. He needed a legitimate heir. A clause in his father's will, clearly drafted by a lawyer well paid to do harm, stated that if Brendan failed to produce a legitimate child within 18 months, the Blackwood lands would pass to his cousin, Abner Hill. Abner, as Brendan explained with the neutrality of one discussing the weather, planned to demolish the tenants' cottages to build manufactories. "There are 46 families on those lands," he said, looking out the window. "The oldest is 83. She was born in that valley." It was the first human thing he had said. Marjorie studied the part of his profile the mask did not cover, the firm jaw, the weight in his eyes of someone who had already decided the world was an adversary and merely negotiated the terms of battle, and understood something her mother had once tried to teach her, something she only now grasped fully. Sometimes a man's harshness is not his nature. It is his scar. "And my family?" she asked. "Your father's debts will be settled, your house returned, your sisters will have dowries sufficient for respectable marriages. And me." He looked at her longer than necessary. "You will be the Countess of Blackwood." It was not an answer, but it was everything he had to offer, and they both knew it. "When?" she asked. "Friday," he replied, as though they were discussing the hour of a meal. It was Wednesday. Marjorie married on a Friday morning when it snowed, not the pretty snow of poems, but the thin, horizontal kind that Yorkshire winds drive against the face like a reprimand. The pastor of the small stone church at the edge of the estate had forgotten to heat it, or perhaps had not bothered, given that the only ones present were herself, Brendan, Hobbs as witness, and an elderly woman in the back pew who had likely come for the regular service and simply received no notice. Marjorie's father did not attend. She had asked him not to, not out of resentment, though there was enough of it to fill that cold church twice over, but because she knew him and knew what he would do upon seeing Brendan, attempt to renegotiate a clause, demand an advance, turn her marriage into one final card game. She chose to spare them all. Her sisters cried when she said goodbye on Thursday afternoon in the sitting room that smelled of mildew and deferred hope. Clara, the second, embraced her so tightly, Marjorie felt her ribs. Beatrix and Jane stood by the door, hand in hand, wide-eyed. "Will you be all right?" Clara whispered. "I always am," Marjorie replied. It was true. It was also the saddest thing in the world. The rings were plain gold, without inscription. Brendan had purchased them through Hobbs. Marjorie knew because when the pastor asked for the rings, Hobbs produced them from his waistcoat pocket with the ease of a man handing over routine documents. Brendan's hand was large, slightly rough at the knuckles, the hands of a man who had worked, ridden across fields and fought before retreating into the dimness of his estate. When he placed the ring on Marjorie's finger, his eyes met hers for a single instant. There was no coldness in them. There was caution, the caution of someone who has learned, in the harshest way, that expecting too much of anything is the shortest path to pain. "With this ring," said the pastor, the words slipping through the cold air like leaves across snow, "I thee wed." Brendan repeated the words. Marjorie repeated the words. And then they were married. He did not kiss her. That was not part of the terms. Blackwood Hall had 32 rooms. Marjorie counted them. It was the sort of thing she did when she was nervous and could not show it. She counted steps, windows, candles, rooms. It was a skill honed over years of managing a household with little money and much pride, and now it served as her anchor in a mansion that smelled of old wax, damp oak, and something she would later identify as accumulated loneliness. The housekeeper, Mrs. Price, was a woman in her 50s, with the face of someone who had witnessed things she preferred not to discuss. She showed the rooms, large, cold, with heavy curtains that blocked what little November sun there was, with the efficiency of duty and the reserve of someone still deciding whether to trust the person before her. "Lord Blackwood has his habits," she said, choosing her words with care. "Everyone does," Marjorie replied. The housekeeper looked at her then with something beyond mere assessment. "He dines alone, works late, does not care for conversation in the morning." A pause. "He does not like noise." "Understood. And the winter garden?" She hesitated, as though the subject were a step that had caused others to stumble. "It is closed. By his order. No one enters." "Why?" "Because it is his order," Mrs. Price repeated, and in her voice was the definitive end of the matter. Marjorie found the winter garden on her own that same afternoon. It lay in a side wing, separated from the main gallery by an iron door with a rusted latch. The structure was glass and blackened metal, or had once been. Now the glass was clouded from within, opaque with moss and damp, and the iron ribs were eaten through with orange rust that stained the stone below like old wounds. She pressed her hand to the glass. Inside, through the haze, there was only darkness, and the silhouettes of empty pots lined up like gravestones. Someone had built that garden for things to grow, and someone had later decided nothing more should. Marjorie stepped back, looked at the rusted latch, at her own hands. Not yet, but soon. That evening she dined alone in the smaller dining room. Hobbs had informed her that the Lord would dine in his study, with the tone of one announcing a law of nature. The food was good, surprisingly so. The cook, a man named Garrett, whom she would meet weeks later, had prepared a lamb stew that smelled of rosemary and care. Someone in that house still cared. She was nearly finished when she heard the footsteps in the corridor, heavy, measured, unhurried. The steps of a man unafraid to take up space. They passed the dining room door without stopping, and then they stopped. There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. Marjorie did not move, did not look at the door, kept her spoon halfway to her mouth as though it were perfectly ordinary. The footsteps resumed, faded down the corridor. She set the spoon down, breathed. Blackwood Hall was a house that feared its own master. And its master, Marjorie understood in that moment, was a man who had paused at a door, only to check whether someone was on the other side. It was little, but it was something, and she had always known how to work with little. The first thing Marjorie did in the second week was open the windows. Not all at once. That would have been a declaration of war, and she was still learning the map of the territory. She began with the music room in the south corridor, which, Hobbs informed her in the neutral tone he used for nearly everything, had not been used in 11 years. There was a grand piano covered with a white sheet so dusty it seemed part of the architecture. Marjorie opened the 2 east-facing windows. November wind rushed in with Yorkshire's characteristic brutality, carried away some dust, and let in a light the room clearly did not expect. The piano, once uncovered, was out of tune, but intact. She played a simple scale with one finger. The sound echoed down the corridors. 2 days later, passing through the same corridor, she noticed the music room door was ajar. She had closed it when she left. She said nothing, But she filed the detail away with the care of someone collecting evidence. The routine at Blackwood Hall was a precise, silent mechanism. Brendan rose before dawn. Marjorie knew by the scent of coffee that reached the upper corridor at 5 in the morning. He worked in his study until midday, rode out across the estate after luncheon, alone, always along the same path by the river, dined at 7, withdrew. Marjorie was not part of this mechanism. She was a new piece that had yet to find its place. So she built her own routine around his, with the care of a watchmaker. She breakfasted early before he came downstairs, spent her mornings exploring the estate. There was a kitchen garden at the back in deplorable condition, and an apple orchard whose trees urgently required pruning. She lunched with Mrs. Price, who gradually relaxed enough to mention, for instance, that his lordship had been bitten by a horse at 12 and had never entirely forgiven small animals, a detail of no immediate use, which Marjorie stored nonetheless. And every afternoon, for exactly 15 minutes, she sat on the stone bench before the closed winter garden and simply remained there. She did not try to enter. She did not touch the latch. She simply stayed. It was in the 3rd week that she found the locket. She was sweeping the library. She had taken on small domestic tasks not out of obligation, but because movement steadied her, and because the maids, she had noticed, feared entering Brendan's space so much that dust had begun to settle into the corners with the comfortable permanence of something that knew it would not be disturbed. When she heard something fall beneath the desk, small, silver, its chain broken in 2. It was an oval locket the size of a large coin engraved on the front with a blooming rosebush, simple, almost naive for so old an object. Marjorie opened it. Inside, on the left, was the faded miniature of a young woman with dark hair and light eyes whom she recognized at once, the same bone structure, the same line of the jaw, as Brendan's mother. On the right, only a date, March 3rd, 1793, the day he was born. She closed the locket, looked at the broken chain, slipped it into her apron pocket and told no one. That night she wrote to the goldsmith in Harrogate. Brendan Hill did not shout. It was important to understand this in order to understand the nature of his tempers. They were not loud. They were atmospheric. When something irritated him, a report delivered late by his steward, a letter from his cousin Abner, whom Marjorie had not yet met, but whose name she already associated with the tension in Brendan's shoulders, the temperature of the room simply dropped 3 degrees. His words grew shorter, the silences longer, and those in his path learned to withdraw. Everyone withdrew, except Marjorie, who either had not learned the lesson or had chosen, quite deliberately, not to. Their first true confrontation came on a December morning. She was in the kitchen with Garrett, the cook, discussing the possibility of replanting the garden at the back. There was room for medicinal herbs, and she had noted that the nearest apothecary lay 2 hours away by carriage, making certain remedies impossible to obtain quickly. Garrett was a man of 50, with enormous hands and a northern accent so thick that at times Marjorie required a moment to decipher him, but he understood soil and plants with the ease of one raised among them. They were laughing. He had told a story about a hen that had escaped the property and been found 3 days later in the village belfry. When the kitchen door opened, Brendan stopped on the threshold. The laughter died. Garrett stepped back instinctively. Marjorie did not. "I was not aware the Countess had assumed management of the kitchen," Brendan said. The neutrality of his voice was the punishment itself. "I have not. I am conversing," she replied. "Do you object to conversation?" A pause. "I object to disruptions of routine." "With respect," she said. And it was genuine, but only to a point. Planting an herb garden disrupts no existing routine. It merely creates a new one. He looked at her for a long moment. Then at Garrett, who was studying the ceiling with sudden intensity. "Plant nothing without consulting me first." He left. Garrett exhaled slowly. "My lady," he said, almost in a whisper, "no one does that." "Does what?" "Stand still when he uses that voice." Marjorie looked at the closed door. "Someone must," she said. There were other moments like that in the weeks that followed. Brendan tested with the instrument he knew best, the cutting silence, the precisely chosen word delivered in the wrong tone, the presence that filled an entire room and pushed everyone else to its edges. Marjorie did not go to the edges, not out of bravery. There were nights when she shut her chamber door and sat on the edge of the bed for long minutes, reconstructing each exchange in her mind, measuring whether she had yielded too much, whether she had crossed a line she ought not to have crossed. It was a constant, exhausting exercise in balance. But there was something she had noticed, something that gave her a kind of compass. After every confrontation, after every heavy silence and sharpened word, Brendan Hill always did one small thing. Once, she found a stack of books on horticulture left upon her work table, without note, without signature. Another time, Hobbs informed her, with that neutral tone she had learned to read as a language of its own, that his lordship had authorized the purchase of garden tools for general use upon the estate. And on a cold December morning, passing the music room, she heard something that made her stop in the corridor. The piano being played, a single simple melody, slow with the hesitation of someone remembering what the fingers once knew. Marjorie did not enter. She kept walking, but she smiled at the empty corridor, which would not betray her. It was in January that he fell ill. Snow had closed the roads for 4 days. The village physician, a man named Calloway, who visited the estate quarterly to examine the older tenants, was on the far side of the valley, unable to cross. And Brendan, who had gone out to inspect the northern pastures on a morning when the temperature had dropped treacherously, returned with lips gone blue and a tremor in his shoulders which Hobbs, when informing Marjorie, described as, "His lordship is slightly indisposed." She went upstairs. Brendan's bedchamber door was closed. Marjorie knocked. Silence. She knocked again. "Go away," he said from within. His voice was different, too low, muffled with the weight of fever. "No," she replied. A long pause. "That was an order, Lady Blackwood. I heard you. Open the door, or I will break it." Another silence. Then the sound of the latch. He had managed to reach the door, only that. He leaned against the wood with the weight of someone who had spent all available strength on that single act. The leather mask was in place, but there was something in his posture, in the way he gripped the frame, unlike anything Marjorie had seen in him before. It was naked vulnerability. She said nothing, stepped inside, guided him back to the bed with her hands on his shoulders, feeling the absurd heat radiating through his coat. He did not resist, which told her more of his condition than any thermometer could. The fever lasted 3 days. Marjorie stayed. Slept in a chair, an uncomfortable one. Not because she fancied herself the heroine of any story. She stayed because it was what needed doing, and because she had learned very early that the things that must be done do not wait for someone more qualified. She brought broth from Garrett's kitchen, changed the compresses, kept the fire lit when he shivered, and opened the window slightly when the heat climbed too high. On the second night he was awake, feverish, but awake. "Why did you not go to bed?" he asked, his voice still rough but clearer. "Because you have a fever, and the doctor is on the far side of 4 feet of snow," Marjorie replied, adjusting the cloth on his forehead. "I have had fevers before." Not while you were my responsibility." He fell silent for a moment. "I am not your responsibility," he said, but there was something in his voice different from his usual coldness, almost a question. "For now, it is what we have," she answered. He looked at the ceiling. Marjorie looked at the fire. "Marjorie," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. "Yes." A long pause. The fire cracked. "Thank you." He was not a man who thanked easily. Marjorie knew that. The word had cost him something. She could hear the cost in it, as though it had been drawn from a place long sealed. "Sleep," she said. And he did. By morning, the fever had broken. Brendan was sitting up in bed when Marjorie entered with coffee. Upright, mask in place, restored to his habitual composure, like a city that works through the night to erase the signs of an earthquake before dawn. But something was different. When Hobbs came in to ask about the day's reports, Brendan answered without his usual sharpness, and when Marjorie rose to leave, he said, without looking at her, examining the papers Hobbs had brought, "The herb garden. Plant whatever you deem necessary." It was not an apology, not a declaration. It was Brendan Hill saying, in the only way he knew, that something had changed. Marjorie left without comment, went downstairs, entered the kitchen and told Garrett they would need seeds, lavender, chamomile and thyme. Garrett looked at her. "It worked," he said, as though she had carried out a plan he had watched with skepticism and now had to acknowledge. "It was not a plan," she said honestly. "I did what needed to be done." He nodded slowly. "It is the same thing," he said, "only more honest." February arrived with less snow and a sharper cold, the sort that crunches beneath boots and leaves the air tasting of iron. And it was in February that the locket returned. The Harrogate goldsmith had done precise work, the chain soldered at a nearly invisible point, the locket cleaned and polished without losing the patina that made it genuine. Marjorie placed it in a small envelope without note. There was nothing to write that would not be excessive, and asked Hobbs to deliver it to his lordship. Nothing happened that day, nor the next. On the third morning, as she went down to breakfast, she found the winter garden open. Not entirely. The iron door stood ajar just enough for an adult to pass sideways, but the rusted latch had been undone. From within drifted the scent of damp earth and long-closed space. Marjorie entered. It was larger inside than it had appeared from without. Winter gardens are like that. The scale shifts when one stands within the glass instead of outside it. Iron ribs arched above her, and through the fogged panes filtered a diffuse light that gave everything the ethereal quality of a winter dream. There were dozens of pots, some clay, some stone, all empty save for soil gone dry and drawn back from the edges as if it had given up. Along the walls stood dark wooden benches, rusted tools hanging from hooks, old packets of seeds that had surely lost their viability years before. At the center of the garden stood a wrought iron chair, and in the chair, Brendan Hill. He sat with his back to the entrance, looking toward one of the glass panels. In his right hand, the locket lay open. He did not turn when she entered. He had heard her, Marjorie knew, because Brendan Hill heard everything, but neither did he ask her to leave. She stood near the door for a moment. Then she moved to the nearest workbench and began examining the pots, touching the soil, assessing what would need replacing and what might be salvaged. It was the sort of task her hands knew how to do without her mind's full supervision, which left her space to remain aware of the silence between them, a silence unlike the others at Blackwood Hall. This was not a silence of exclusion. It was a silence of company. "She loved this garden," he said without turning, his voice low, stripped of its usual armor. "My mother. She would spend hours here in winter, because she said it was the only place in the house where the cold stayed outside. Marjorie did not answer at once. She had learned that Brendan needed space around his words. "What was she like?" she asked after a moment. "Stubborn," he said, and there was something in it that was almost affection. She did not believe any problem was too large to be solved with enough work. A pause. "The fire happened when I was 8. She died trying to get me out. She succeeded." The last word lingered between them with the particular weight of things never fully spoken. "She did," Marjorie repeated softly, not as an echo, but as confirmation, as recognition that the most important part of that sentence was precisely that. She had succeeded. Brendan closed the locket. "Why did you repair it?" he asked. "You might have kept it, or simply discarded it." "Because it was yours," she said. "What belongs to someone ought to return to them." At last he turned. Marjorie was examining a clay pot, and did not look at him immediately. Not out of shyness, but because she had learned that looking at Brendan Hill too directly, before he was ready, was the quickest way to make him raise his walls again. When she did look, he was studying her with an expression she had not yet fully learned to name. It was not admiration, not gratitude, but something older and more cautious than either. The look of a man revisiting a conclusion he had drawn long ago about human nature, and discovering with discomfort that he might be wrong. "This garden can be restored," she said, glancing around. "It would need fresh soil, spring bulbs if we plant now, and 2 of the north panels repaired. They're letting in too much damp, but it can bloom." Brendan was silent for a long moment. "Do what you need," he said at last. It was the 3rd time he had said it. Marjorie knew, and he knew that she knew, that they were no longer speaking only of gardens. Abner Hill arrived at Blackwood Hall on a March afternoon without prior notice, which Marjorie would later understand was precisely the point. She saw him first from the upstairs window, a man of about 40, stepping down from a carriage too new for Yorkshire mud, carrying himself like one accustomed to entering places uninvited, and persuading himself it was not rudeness, but entitlement. He was handsome, Abner. That surprised her slightly. She had imagined a villain with coarse features, but Abner possessed a pleasant face and the easy smile of a man who had learned early that the best armor is affability. Well-combed brown hair, impeccable attire, hands without calluses. The hands of a man who had never built anything. Brendan received him in the drawing room. Marjorie knew through Hobbs, who had developed the habit of keeping the Countess informed, with a quiet loyalty she had never explicitly requested, and which, therefore, was worth twice as much. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When Abner left, the smile remained, but there was something in his eyes that Marjorie, watching from the upper corridor, identified precisely. He had come to assess. And he had left satisfied with what he found. At dinner, Abner stayed for dinner naturally. He took his seat with the familiarity of one who requires no invitation because he considers everything his in advance, and directed all his attention toward Marjorie with the calculated enthusiasm of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "Lady Blackwood," he said with that smile, "what a relief to find you so settled. I feared life in Yorkshire might prove too austere for a lady of your refinements." "Yorkshire has its charms," Marjorie replied, with the same polite emptiness. "One learns to appreciate them." Of course, of course." Abner inclined his head slightly toward Brendan. "And my cousin has been an attentive host, I trust." There was a fraction of a second, only one, in which Marjorie felt the weight of that question. It was not social curiosity. It was a probe. Abner was measuring the distance between them, testing for cracks that might be widened. "Your cousin," said Marjorie, with a calm that required no effort because it was genuine, has been precisely the husband I required. Abner's smile widened, but his eyes did not follow. Across the table, Brendan looked down at his plate, but Marjorie, who had learned to read the language of his silence, saw the tension in his shoulders ease by a barely perceptible degree. She had said the right thing, not as strategy, but because it was true. Abner remained at Blackwood Hall for 2 days. 2 days were enough for a man of Abner's ability to do considerable damage. Marjorie would understand this only later, when the consequences began to appear with the cruel punctuality of well-laid plans. The first sign was a letter. It arrived a week after Abner's departure, addressed to Brendan, bearing the seal of a London solicitor. Marjorie did not read it. It was not hers to read, but she saw its effect. Brendan left his study that afternoon with the closed expression of a man whose old wound had been reopened, and he did not dine. The second sign was Hobbs. The butler found her in the library the following day, with the look of a man carrying information he was not entirely certain he ought to deliver. "My lady," he said, choosing each word as though stepping between stones in a river. Mr. Abner, during his visit, made certain inquiries among the staff. "What sort of inquiries?" Marjorie asked, without lifting her eyes from the book she pretended to read. "Regarding the nature of the relationship between your ladyship and his lordship." A pause. "And whether your ladyship had received correspondence from any gentleman in London." Marjorie closed the book. "And did the staff answer?" "The staff," said Hobbs, with a dignity Marjorie would never forget, "found nothing to report." As there was nothing to report, she looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Hobbs." "My lady." He inclined his head and withdrew, but Abner had been more careful than Marjorie had anticipated. He had not planted a full lie. That would have been too crude, too easily disproven. And the shadow had found fertile ground in the one place where Brendan Hill was entirely vulnerable, his conviction that no one could wish to remain by his side without financial motive. Marjorie understood this one March afternoon when she went down to the winter garden, now beginning to bloom, the first shoots of lavender visible in the fresh soil, and found the iron door closed, locked. She stood before it for a long moment, her hand against the cold metal. It was not the garden. It was the message. Brendan had withdrawn. He had planted a shadow, an insinuation here, an observation there, delivered with the pleasant smile of one who is not accusing, merely sharing familial concern. He had believed something Abner had said, or suggested, and had done what he always did when he believed himself on the brink of being hurt. He closed the door before anyone could close it on him. Marjorie removed her hand from the iron, breathed, and went to find her husband. She found him in his study. He stood before the window, the same posture as the first day, shoulders tense, the weight he had carried so long, he no longer knew how to separate it from himself. He did not turn when she entered, nor did he tell her to leave, which Marjorie had learned to read as a kind of permission. She closed the door behind her, stood in the center of the room, did not approach the window. This was not the moment to reduce physical distance. This was the moment to speak clearly across it. "What did Abner tell you?" she asked. A pause. "Nothing that was not reasonable to consider," Brendan replied, his voice flat with the tone he used when shielding himself. "That is not an answer. It is all I have to give." Marjorie was silent for a moment. Then, "Brendan, look at me." He turned, and Marjorie saw, by the cruel clarity of a moment when all facades loosen slightly, what lay beneath the closed expression. Not anger. Fear. The particular fear of a man who had begun to believe in something and was now bracing himself for the pain of having believed wrongly. She knew that fear. She had lived her own version of it for years. The fear of wanting something for herself and discovering she had waited too long. "There is no gentleman in London," she said, with the same calm she might use to name a plant or remark upon the day's temperature. "There is no secret correspondence. There is no hidden reason for my being here beyond the ones you have known from the beginning." Brendan did not respond. "But you must understand something," Marjorie continued, and there was something different in her voice now, more serious, more bare. "The reasons I came were obligation and necessity. You know that. I know that. And those reasons are true, and I am not ashamed of them." She paused. Brendan waited. "But they are no longer the only reasons I stay." The silence that followed carried a different weight from any that had inhabited Blackwood Hall before. It was the silence of a sentence that cannot be taken back, that fills the space of a room permanently once spoken. Brendan Hill looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something Marjorie had never seen before. He lowered his eyes, not in shame, in something closer to humility, the humility of a man who has spent decades convinced of a truth about himself, and is now, for the first time, considering that he might have been wrong. "Marjorie," he said. His voice was different, unarmored. "I do not know how to do this." "Do what?" "Trust," he said simply. "I do not know how." She looked at him for a moment, at the leather mask, at the shoulders that carried decades of chosen isolation, at the hands that had played the piano alone and returned the goldsmith's parcel without a word, and paused outside a dining room door merely to see whether someone was within. "One learns," she said, "the way one learns anything difficult, by doing it, by failing, by doing it again." A long pause. "You are not going to London," he said. It was not an order, it was almost a question. "I am going to London," Marjorie replied, "but not for any reason Abner imagines. I am going because the honor he tried to stain is yours, not mine, and because there are things that must be said in person to certain solicitors about certain clauses in certain ill-drafted wills." Brendan looked at her. "You do not have to do this." "I know," said Marjorie. "That is why I will." London was loud. Marjorie had forgotten that, or perhaps she had never noticed it so sharply before, because prior to Blackwood Hall there had been no Yorkshire silence as counterpoint. Now the noise of the city struck her as something physical, the smell of coal and horses and crowds, overlapping voices, carriage wheels on cobblestone, street vendors calling. She stayed at the Vance family home, the house Brendan had restored to her sisters, and which Clara had transformed with the quiet competence of someone finally given space to exercise it. Her sisters received her with the commotion of those who had stored questions for months, and now released them all at once. "Are you well?" Clara asked, studying Marjorie's face with the eyes that had always known how to read what she did not say. "I am," Marjorie answered, and it was true in a way that had taken her time to recognize. Not merely surviving, but genuinely well. "Is he as they say?" Beatrix, the youngest, asked with the direct curiosity of adolescence. "No," said Marjorie. Marjorie sat before his desk, with the posture she had learned over months beside Brendan Hill. Upright, unhurried, occupying the space that was hers without asking permission. She placed the documents on the desk, materials she had reviewed with the Blackwood steward before leaving, timelines, revisions of the original clause, letters from tenants spanning decades that proved continuity of tenure. "The clause is valid," Whitmore said, without looking at them. "The clause," Marjorie replied with the same calm, "was drafted by a solicitor retained by Abner Hill to benefit Abner Hill, which constitutes a conflict of interest any court of chancery would recognize in 15 minutes. She paused. He is far better. The solicitor was named Whitmore, and his office lay in the old part of the city, dark and smelling of aged paper and carefully accumulated power. You know it. I know it. And now we both know that the other knows. Whitmore regarded her for a long moment. You are very direct for a countess, he said at last. I am from Yorkshire, Marjorie answered. The cold teaches one not to waste time. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When Marjorie left, new agreements were in writing, and Abner Hill had a considerably larger problem than he had anticipated. That afternoon, James Spencer stood behind the counter of Spencer's confectionery with the heightened attention of someone who has learned that in Covent Garden the best way to wait for a customer is to pretend one is not listening. The two Vance servants leaned over the display of macarons. Lavender, they decided, the very ones the Countess of Blackwood had specifically requested, and one of them said in a voice that was not a whisper at all, "She came back different, lighter, and they say the Earl, the one who frightened even the horses, has begun ordering flowers for the garden." The other stood with his finger pointed at the raspberry macarons for a long second. Flowers. Him. Flowers. Him. That evening, by the light of a single candle at the upstairs desk, with the shop closed below and the last sounds of Covent Garden fading in the street, James Spencer opened his notebook, dipped his pen, and wrote with the particular pleasure of someone saving the best news for last. Dear readers, this time there is no scandal to report. There is something considerably rarer, a Yorkshireman who has ordered flowers, and a countess who has asked for lavender macarons. Make of that what you will. I already know what I think. At her sister's house, Marjorie wrote to Brendan that same night, at the small desk in Clara's room. It was not a long letter. It said only that the matter had been resolved, that the tenant families could rest easy, and that she would return in 3 days. On the final line, after a hesitation that lasted perhaps a full minute, she added, "The garden must be needing water." It was a way of saying something else. He would understand. Brendan Hill spent the 3 days of Marjorie's absence doing things he had not done in years. On the first day, he sent for the village carpenter and requested that the 2 north-facing glass panels of the winter garden be repaired. He watched the work for nearly 2 hours from the iron bench at the center of the garden, saying nothing beyond what was necessary. On the second day he went to the stables, for the first time since the previous winter, and personally inspected the mares Marjorie had mentioned in passing to the stable hand 3 weeks earlier. One had a loose shoe. He saw it mended. On the third day he entered the music room. He stood before the piano for a long time. Thou full piece, a sonata his mother had taught him when he was 6, before the fire, before everything, from beginning to end, with all its errors and all its right notes, without stopping. Hobbs, who passed the corridor twice during the performance, would later tell Garrett, in a tone he rarely used, that there had been something in the sound that was not merely music. It was a man remembering how to occupy space. Marjorie's carriage arrived on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Brendan was in the courtyard when she descended, not by chance, though neither of them would mention it. Then he sat, lifted the lid, and played. Not the hesitant scale of earlier days. He stood by the stone archway in his usual posture, shoulders squared, mask in place. But there was something different that Marjorie recognized before she had even finished stepping down. He had come to the courtyard. Brendan Hill, who never received anyone there, who left Hobbs to attend all arrivals and departures, had come himself. She stopped before him. The Yorkshire wind pushed the last leaves of March across the stone. The sky held that particular late afternoon blue, found only in the north of England, a blue that seems deeper than possible. "The solicitor is settled," she said. "I know," he replied. "I received a letter from Whitmore this morning." A pause. "You intimidated him. I presented arguments." "It is the same thing," he said, and there was something in it that was unmistakably affection. "When you present them," she looked at him, at the mask, at the eyes studying her with that expression she had finally learned to name, the expression of someone discovering, for the first time in adult life, that it is possible to be seen and not be hurt. "The garden panels have been repaired," he said at last, as if reporting the weather. "I saw," Marjorie replied, and then, more softly, "Thank you." The wind passed. Somewhere on the estate a horse whinnied. "Come in," Brendan said. "Garrett made stew." It was an invitation, it was stew. It was Brendan Hill saying, with the limited vocabulary life had left him for expressing large things, that someone was waiting on the other side of the door. Marjorie went in. Spring came to Blackwood Hall as it comes to all northern places, late, quiet, and utterly determined. In April, the bulbs Marjorie had planted in the winter garden began to open. First the lavender, small purple spears piercing the new soil with the quiet insistence of things that grow, because that is what they do. Then chamomile, daffodils, and at last, stubborn in the particular way of flowers worth waiting for, the roses she had grafted on a cold February afternoon using a method Mrs. Price had declared impossible, and Garrett had wagered would fail. It did not fail. Brendan entered the garden one April morning and stood before the roses for a long time, saying nothing. Marjorie was at the opposite bench, transplanting seedlings, and did not hurry him. She had learned that Brendan's silences before beautiful things were a kind of private prayer. He needed that time to accept that the good thing was real and would not be taken away. After a while he sat in the iron chair at the center of the garden. She continued working. They remained so for perhaps half an hour, she working, he quiet, the two of them sharing the same space with the ease of people who no longer need to fill one another's silence. It was a kind of intimacy Marjorie had not anticipated when she arrived at Blackwood Hall that grey November. Not the dramatic intimacy of the novels her sisters read, but the quiet intimacy of two lives that had learned to fit within the same house without either needing to diminish. It was that morning that he removed the mask. Not ceremoniously. There was no speech, no request for permission. Simply, at a moment when the sun slipped through the repaired glass panels and warmed the garden in a way the garden itself did not seem to expect, Brendan lifted a hand to his face and removed the leather mask with the simple gesture of someone removing a coat in a room that had finally reached the proper temperature. Marjorie did not stop working, not because it held no meaning. There was meaning, a density in the air she recognized as a moment not to be disturbed, but because there was something more important than the grandeur of the gesture, the fact that he had done it in his own time, at his own pace, without her asking or expecting or pressing. Scars marked the left side of his face with the honesty of things that have happened and do not apologize for having happened. They were old, fully healed, the skin drawn tight in places, too smooth in others, bearing that particular quality fire leaves behind. They were not terrible. They were part of a face Marjorie had come to know through its expressions, and which was now simply complete. She understood that in removing the mask, he was bidding farewell to the man he had been, and to the weight of the past. She looked at him for a moment, then returned to the seedlings. "The rose on the north side will need support," she said. "The stem is still thin." "I will see to it," Brendan replied. And that was all. It was enough. It was more than enough. Later that same afternoon, Marjorie found herself seated on the garden bench while Brendan carefully tied the rose's stem to a bamboo stake, a task his large hands performed with a delicacy she would not forget. April sunlight in Yorkshire carries a particular golden quality, as though apologizing for its long absence with warmth more generous than necessary. She thought of her sisters in London, of the kitchen garden now finally yielding, of the 46 tenant families on Blackwood land who had slept more easily since Whitmore had returned the revised documents, of Garrett's stew, which stood beyond dispute among the finest things she had ever tasted. She thought of the woman who had arrived at that estate in November with calloused hands, and the quiet conviction that she had given too much to the world and received less than she deserved in return. That woman had not disappeared, but she had discovered something not included in the terms of the original contract, that sometimes the place one arrives by obligation becomes, through the steady insistence of two people who choose to try, the place one chooses to stay. Brendan finished tying the rose. He stood examining his work. Then, without turning, he said, "Marjorie." "Yes?" A pause. The wind between the glass panes. The lavender shifting. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." She looked at the garden that had once been barren and now bloomed with the quiet determination of all that refuses to give up. "Thank you," she replied, "for opening the door." Brendan turned, and this time, without the mask, she saw what lay beneath his expression. Not the usual caution, not the weight of decades. She saw a man who had at last stopped bracing himself for pain. It was the beginning of a long spring. In Yorkshire, the best springs always are. The Patmore Chronicles. Dear readers of the county, who would have told us that grey November, that Blackwood Hall would bloom by April? We would have laughed with the restrained elegance of those raised not to laugh aloud in public. And yet it has bloomed. The roses stand in the glass garden. The piano plays in the afternoon. And the Earl of Blackwood has been seen indeed, his large hands tying with care the stem of a rose to a bamboo stake, while his countess transplanted seedlings beside him without offering a single instruction. Sometimes, my dear readers, love does not arrive with declarations and storms. It arrives as spring does in Yorkshire, late, quiet, and absolutely determined. Marjorie Vance did not save Brendan Hill. She merely remained while he remembered how to save himself, and that, permit us to say with all the solemnity the moment deserves, is the finest romance we have yet recorded in these columns. Tom Patmore, if you've made it this far, if you followed every chapter, every silence, every door Marjorie refused to leave closed, then you know this story is not only about an earl and a countess. It is about what happens when we stop bracing for pain and begin to accept that something good might be real. It is about gardens that bloom because someone chooses simply to stay. Have you ever met someone who needed you to stay? Or were you the one who needed someone to stay for you? If this story touched something in you, leave a like to help it reach more people who might need it. Follow the channel so you don't miss the next audiobook, because the next story carries just as much feeling. And tell me in the comments, which moment did you hear without being able to smile or without your eyes filling? I read them all. Always.